So today we're going to be going over the best builds for New Game Plus. Now all the gameplay is going to be at New Game Plus 1 and at level 175. If you did want to see some builds at lower levels, I have a whole dedicated playlist full of top 5 builds covering every single type of stat and damage type, so definitely check those ones out. As for today's video though, I did want to make a bunch of different builds, so there will be plenty of stuff that doesn't make it to the list, but that's because I've already made those builds in previous videos. But as to what makes all of these New Game Plus builds themselves, is that they probably require you to go to New Game Plus. They tend to perform better at higher levels, or they just get the stuff at the end of the game that you can only really enjoy it when going to New Game Plus. As always, don't focus too much on the ranking side of things. I just rank them based on how I enjoy them. All of these builds are just as good as one another. But yeah, that out of the way, let's just get into it. Starting off at number 5, we have an intelligence build using both of the magic-based spears. In our main hand, we have the Death Ritual Spear, which has an amazing weapon skill in Spear Core Ritual, which for 20 FP just raise a whole bunch of spears down from the sky, scales purely off intelligence, and just melts enemies for days. This weapon also gets 110 crit multiplier, which performs really well because this thing does amazing poise damage, and you do get a unique heavy attack with its horizontal swipe as well. In our offhand, we have the claymans harpoon, which is an amazing intelligence-based spear. Scales very well with intelligence, so we're going to have it magic infused with ice spear. Now, ice spear is going to be a very solid projectile that does very good damage, very good frost build up, and staggers pretty well on top of that. Now, both of these weapon skills conveniently actually do get boosted by the Spellblade set, so we're actually going to have the entire set equipped, which actually boosts the skill damage by 10% in total. As for our talismans, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander to further boost the skill damage by 15%. The Magic Scorpion Charm, which also boosts by 50% but decreases our damage negation. The Ritual Sword Talisman at maximum HP increases our damage output by 10% as well. And the Carrying Filigree Crest to decrease the FP cost of both of these skills because we're going to be spamming them over and over again. Now we do have the Dagger in our offhand, which has Golden Fowl infused onto it because that's just going to be 10% more damage and 10% more defenses for pretty much free, so you might as well. And as for our spells, we aren't going to be using much because the Death Ritual Spear and the Clayman's Harpoon with Ice Spear is going to be our main options in terms of projectiles because we're just going to spam those. But we are going to have Rani's Darkmoon, which is going to be a very nice debuff that we can use at the beginning of the boss fight to just debuff the enemies, do a bunch of frost build up as well. We're going to have the Loretta's Great Bow, which is a very nice sniping projectile. Now, you can use Loretta's Mastery. I just don't really like Loretta's Mastery much because it consumes about twice as much as FP and doesn't really do that much more damage. And we are going to have Terra Magica as well. It creates a pool on the ground to just make us do a bunch more magic damage on top of that. At number 4, we have a build using a couple of giant crushers. Now, when making this video, I realized there was a severe lack of strength representation, to which I decided to make this bad boy right here, and honestly, it doesn't really get much more strength than this build. So yes, we're going to have 2 different giant crushers, which does require to go to New Game Plus because you can only get 1 per playthrough. And in our offhand, we're going to have one infused with Cragblade, which does boost our physical damage by 15% and add 10% more stance damage. And in our main hand, we're going to have Roll in that Resolve, which boosts our next attack by 80%. Now, you can actually have Cragblade into both if you wanted to. I'm just going to go Roll in that Resolve to maximize our damage because it's going to spam a bunch of jumping attacks with this build, which leads into our armor sets, our chest piece in particular, the Raptor Feathers chest piece, which does boost our jumping attack damage by 10%, which the Claw Talisman also does as well, which we also have, and the Ritual Sword Talisman at maximum HP, another 10%, and we have a couple of equipment load-based talismans to just up our equipment load, because obviously these 2 weapons are the heaviest weapons in the entire game, and we're going to have 40 endurance to go alongside with that, just to actually, be able to have some type of armor and medium load at the exact same time. Now we're going to go into 80 strength, going to have 65 vigor, and we're going to have 17 faith. The reason I have 17 faith is because we can use the Claw Mark Seal and actually get some decent type of incantations. And Lightning Spear is a cool projectile if you just want to to bait enemies in or whatnot. Let's have a projectile option in general. And Lightning Spear is pretty cheap. Now we are going to have the Faith Crystal tier. So when you drink that, we get plus 10 to Faith and actually go to 27, which is the minimum requirements for Golden Vow and Flame Giving Strength, which is actually 25 Faith, but still perfectly fine. But we're going to have more buffs just so we can have a bunch of uptime with our buffs and just keep spamming jumping attacks over and over again. As you can tell by that gameplay, things are just getting destroyed. So yeah, this one gets number 4. Number 3, we have a build using the Scavengers Curse Swords and Dragon Incantations on the side. So yes, once again, we're going to require to go to New Game Plus because you can only get 1 Scavenger Curse Sword per playthrough, but it is going to be a bleed-based Curse Sword you can infuse, and we're going to pair it with an Occult Infusion because when you level up your Arcane, it is going to improve your blood loss build-up itself, and we're going to have 80 points to Arcane, so it's going to just shred a whole bunch of enemies and proc bleed very quickly. But on our offhands, we're going to have 1 infused with Seppuku, which actually does add more blood loss build up and actually does scale with the arcane. And in our main hand, we're going to have Bloodblade, which is like a quick projectile option if you did want to pick enemies up pretty quickly, and it does like a bunch of blood loss build up as well. You can use it as point blank range and it'll perform way better than Reduvia ever would. Now we're going to use things like the White Mask and the Lord of Blood Exaltation Talisman to actually when you do proc bleed at close distance, it's going to boost our damage by a lot more. And we can use something like seppuku to instantly proc those buffs, because if you proc bleed on ourselves or an enemy, it actually does work as well. And you can just proc bleed in and switch to your dragon incantations and just do a whole bunch of damage that way. As you can probably tell by the gameplay, these dragon incantations melt extremely hard. So yes, we're going to have the dragon communion seal as well. We're going to have the raw medallion and the flock canvas talisman to boost the damage of these dragon incantations. Now, the incantations themselves, you just want to have all like the lesser versions. You don't have the named based dragon ones because they consume 25% more FP, but only do 17% more damage. So I just prefer the lesser versions themselves. I do like to have at least one named one, just in case you wanted to use one when jumping into the air for whatever reason. But yeah, using things like Grail's Roar as well to debuff enemies. And Friedrich's Magma is definitely going to be the best fire-based one, because it just shreds enemies, as you can probably tell by getting against Radagon. It just fucks him up completely. But as for the rest of the build, we're going to have the Raptor Feathers chest piece and the Claw Talisman to spam jumping attacks when need be, because this build with Curved Swords, Power Stance, the jumping attacks is hit multiple times and it's absolutely shred. Number 2, we have an intelligence build using both the Darkmoon Greatsword and the helphens steeple. Now both of these do have very similar scalings, hence why we're going to Power Stance them together. How this build is going to work is that we're just going to have the helphens steeple use its weapon skill, which does add more frost and magic damage, and use the Darkmoon Greatsword weapon skill, which pretty much does the exact same thing, but actually turns our heavy attacks into projectiles, which is honestly an insane projectile. Does really good stance damage, really good frost buildup, and regular magic damage itself. So basically, we don't need to use any spells at all, but obviously we're in New Game Plus, we're at a high level. We have 30 points into mind, so we might as well. Now we are going to have the dagger in our offhand just to have Golden Vow to just boost our damage further. As for our talismans, we're going to have Magic Scorpion Charm, Godfrey's Icon, and the Shard of Alexander. Now both of these two talismans, they do enhance the heavy attack damage of the Darkmoon Greatsword, and we're going to have the Ritual Sword Talisman to enhance our damage at maximum HP. Now we are going to have the Lusat stuff, which actually is going to be the best stuff in terms of sorcery scaling, but it does make our sorceries a bit more expensive as well. But the sorceries themselves are just going to be secondary to our build, because we already have an amazing projectile in the Darkmoon Greatsword, so the rest of your spells should just work around that. So basically, we're going to have the Knight's Comet, which is very good against enemies that like to input read. We're going to have Magma Shot against enemies that are weak to fire, or if you go up against an enemy that's weak or actually resistant to magic. And we're going to have the Meteorite Avastel, a good physical type of spell. Comet Azure, which just melts enemies or melts bosses that don't really move as much. I like to use Meteorite Avastel as like a boss melting one for enemies that like to move around, and then Comet of Azure, or Comet Azure against enemies that don't really move as much. And we're going to have Terra Magica, which is obviously a nice buff that just boosts our magic damage in general. But yeah, when you're actually using this build, if you plan to use your sorceries at the beginning of the fight, I recommend using the Cerulean Hidden tier and actually switching to your sorcery-based talismans to just enhance the damage in that regard. But yeah, for the most part, you can just like leave the Darkmoon Greatsword on and just use that the entire time. Number 1, we have a Faith and Dexterity build using the Sacred Relic Sword. Now this is an amazing weapon. Its weapon skill, Wave of Gold, pretty much clears out the entire room, does a whole bunch of damage, even against enemies that are resistant to Holy, which is a lot in this game. It still does decent damage to them. But this downside to it is that it does consume 40 FP, or 42 FP, but at the moment it's only consuming 27 FP because I do have the Carrion Filigood crest and the Ash of War Scarab helmet on to decrease it to that much. Now the helmet is going to decrease my damage negation by 5%, which is a necessary trade-off because 27 FP for this weapon skill is just honestly insane. Now, as for the rest of the talismans, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander, Ritual Sword Talisman to boost our damage by 10% at full health, and we're going to have the Holy Scorpion Charm. Now, for this charm, you can just like interchange it between the lightning and the fire-based one, depending on what type of spells that you wanted to use, which getting into our spells, we have Catch Flame, which is probably like the best incantation in the game because you can just keep spamming it over and over again. It's extremely risk-free. Gonna have Lightning Spear. We're gonna have Ancient Drag as Lightning Strike against like larger enemies that can get melted. You can just switch to the Lightning Scorpion Charm and just use this one instead. Gonna have the Crucible Tail. I just like to have a Crucible incantation in general, just in case you go up against an enemy that is like weak to physical more so than elemental damage. Gonna have Black Blade, which is a Destined Death based spell that does decrease the enemy's HP by 10% and do some damage over time effect. And you are gonna have the Black Knife Dagger, which actually does stack with one another, which is very nice because the Black Knife actually has very similar scalings to their Sacred Relic Sword, and both actually do scale off Faith, hence why we're going to go into 70 Faith, even though these things probably get a bit more better in Dexterity scalings. But with our 70 Faith, we can use the Faith tier, get ourselves to 80 Faith, use a bunch of these spells, do a whole bunch of damage, and use our weapon skills with both scale off Faith to just do even more damage as well. And yes, we are going to use Golden Vow for a nice damage negation spell and our damage boosting spell, and we're going to have Howl of Shiburi, which does boost our damage by about 25%, but makes us take us 30% more damage. Now, you should use this against like certain types of boss fights if you're going to sit at the back of the map and just spam a bunch of projectiles really. But for the most part, I wouldn't really use it in like the heat of combat depending on what types of bosses you are fighting. But if you are pretty confident, I would recommend just using the Hellish Shiburi because 25% more damage just means you're just shredding literally everything. But yeah, that pretty much concludes it for this one. As always, please do like and subscribe because I do have more videos coming along the way. If you don't want to see something in particular with like a top 5 or whatnot, just let me know down in the comments. But yeah, that way, see you next one guys. Bye.